Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here tonight to discuss what has become one of the most explosive issues in American politics today. We've all seen the headlines, haven't we? Trump explodes. I don't want them here. The Somali community is once again caught in the crosshairs of political rhetoric that ignites passionate debate across our nation. But before we get swept up in the emotional firestorm, I want us to do something that's become increasingly rare in our political discourse. I want us to think critically. I want us to follow the money. And I want us to ask the question that nobody in power wants you to ask: who actually benefits from this manufactured outrage? Now, let me be clear from the outset. I'm an economist, not a politician. My job isn't to defend or attack any particular individual or community. My job is to help you understand the economic structures that shape our world, and more importantly, to reveal the economic interests that hide behind the inflammatory language we hear every single day. So when we hear explosive statements about immigrant communities, whether they're Somali, Mexican, Haitian, or any other group, we need to step back and ask ourselves what economic reality is being obscured by this political theater. Here's the hook that should grab your attention. Every time a politician screams about immigrants taking your jobs or draining your resources, a corporate executive somewhere is laughing all the way to the bank. Why? Because while you're being told to blame your struggling neighbor who happened to be born in Somalia, you're not noticing the billionaire who just moved his factory to Bangladesh, slashed your wages, eliminated your pension, and convinced the government to give him a tax break that could fund your child's school for the next decade. This is not an accident, my friends. This is a strategy as old as capitalism itself. Divide the working class so they never unite against the people who are actually exploiting them. Let me take you through the economic history that explains our current moment. The United States has always had a complex relationship with immigration, and that relationship has always been determined by one thing: the needs of capital. When American industry needed labor to build the railroads in the 19th century, we imported Chinese workers. When agricultural interests needed cheap labor, we created programs to bring in Mexican workers. When the tech industry needed skilled professionals, we expanded H-1B visas. And when businesses wanted to keep wages low and workers desperate, they've always maintained a population of vulnerable immigrants who could be super exploited. This isn't compassion, and it isn't cruelty. It's capitalism operating exactly as it's designed to operate. Now, let's talk specifically about the Somali community that's been targeted in this latest controversy. Somalis began arriving in the United States in significant numbers in the 1990s, fleeing civil war and instability in their homeland. Many settled in places like Minneapolis, Columbus, and Lewiston, Maine. These communities have done what immigrant communities have always done in America. They've worked incredibly hard, often in jobs that native-born Americans won't take, at wages that native-born Americans won't accept. They work in meatpacking plants, in warehouses, driving taxis and ride shares, running small businesses. They pay taxes, including sales taxes, property taxes, and yes, income taxes, even though many politicians would have you believe otherwise. But here's what the inflammatory rhetoric never tells you. These communities aren't draining the economy. They're often propping up industries and revitalizing neighborhoods that had been abandoned by capital flight. When factories closed in the Midwest and corporations moved production overseas, immigrant communities moved into those hollowed-out towns and tried to rebuild. They're not the cause of economic decline. They're arriving in the aftermath of an economic system that has already destroyed those communities through deindustrialization, financialization, and systematic transfer of wealth from workers to shareholders. So when we hear explosive statements like "I don't want them here," we need to decode the economic subtext. What's really being said is this: I want you to be angry at these visible, vulnerable people so that you don't ask why your real wages haven't increased in 40 years. I want you to focus on the person who looks different, speaks differently, or prays differently, so that you don't notice that the top 1% of Americans now own more wealth than the bottom 90% combined. I want you to believe that your enemy is the Somali refugee working 2 jobs to feed her family, not the pharmaceutical executive who just raised the price of insulin by 300%. Let me give you some concrete numbers that put this in perspective. The entire federal budget for refugee resettlement is a tiny fraction of what we spend on corporate subsidies and tax breaks for the wealthy. We're talking about billions versus trillions. If we're concerned about fiscal responsibility, why aren't we talking about the companies that pay $0 in federal taxes while making record profits? Why aren't we discussing the Pentagon budget that consumes more than half of discretionary spending? Why aren't we examining the carried interest loophole that allows hedge fund managers to pay lower tax rates than their secretaries? Because those conversations would threaten real power, and it's much easier to punch down at communities that can't fight back. Now, some of you might be thinking, Professor Wolff, are you saying there are no legitimate concerns about immigration policy? Of course not. Any rational society needs to have serious discussions about immigration levels, integration processes, and resource allocation. But here's the critical distinction. We can't have honest discussions when the terms of debate are set by people who benefit from keeping us divided. We can't have productive policy conversations when the starting point is demonization rather than analysis. And we absolutely cannot address the real challenges facing American workers if we're blaming immigrants for problems that are actually caused by corporate power and capitalist exploitation. Think about it this way. If you're struggling to pay your rent, is it because a Somali family moved into your neighborhood? Or is it because private equity firms have bought up housing stock and are artificially inflating prices to maximize returns for their investors? If you can't afford health care, is it because refugees are overwhelming the system? Or is it because we're the only developed nation that treats healthcare as a commodity to be sold for profit, rather than a human right to be guaranteed for all? If your child's school is falling apart, is it because immigrant children are in the classroom? Or is it because we've systematically defunded public education while giving tax breaks to the wealthy and subsidizing private schools? The answers to these questions reveal an uncomfortable truth that challenges the dominant narrative in American politics. The real divide in our society isn't between native, born, and immigrant, or between white and black, or between Christian and Muslim. The real divide is between those who own and control the means of production and those who must sell their labor to survive. It's between the tiny fraction of people who have accumulated obscene amounts of wealth and power and the vast majority of us who are struggling to make ends meet while being told to fight each other for crumbs. This brings me to another crucial point that often gets lost in these debates. The very instability that forces people to flee countries like Somalia is itself a product of global economic and political systems that benefit wealthy nations and corporations. When we destabilize regions through military intervention, support dictators who serve corporate interests, or impose economic policies through institutions like the IMF and World Bank that prioritize debt repayment over human development, we create the conditions that force people to migrate. Then we have the audacity to act shocked when refugees show up at our borders seeking safety. We break their countries and then demonize them for leaving. This is the height of hypocrisy. Let me tell you what real immigration reform would look like if we were serious about addressing the root causes rather than scapegoating vulnerable people. First, we would stop the military interventions and economic policies that destabilize other countries and create refugee crises in the first place. Second, we would enforce labor laws that prevent any employer from exploiting any worker, regardless of their immigration status, which would eliminate the economic incentive to hire undocumented workers at sub-minimum wages. Third, we would create a rational, humane immigration system that acknowledges both our economic needs and our humanitarian obligations. And fourth, we would invest in the working class communities, both immigrant and native born, that have been devastated by decades of neoliberal economic policy. But none of that will happen as long as we allow politicians to manipulate our fears and prejudices for their own benefit. Every minute we spend arguing about whether Somali refugees belong in America is a minute we're not spending demanding universal health care, or free public education, or a living wage, or affordable housing, or any of the things that would actually improve our lives. This is not accidental. This is the oldest trick in the book. Keep the working class fighting each other so they never unite against their common exploiters. I want to leave you with a challenge tonight. The next time you hear inflammatory rhetoric about any immigrant community, I want you to ask yourself 3 questions. First, who is saying this, and what do they gain from saying it? Second, what economic reality is being hidden behind this emotional appeal? And third, who actually has the power to change my material conditions, and what are they doing with that power? I guarantee you that if you honestly answer those questions, you'll find that the real threats to your well-being are not coming from refugee families trying to build a better life. They're coming from boardrooms and country clubs where decisions are made that affect millions of lives in pursuit of private profit. In closing, I want to return to the fundamental principle that guides all of my work as an economist and an educator. We cannot solve our problems if we misdiagnose their causes. If we believe that our economic struggles are caused by immigrants, we will waste our energy on cruel and counterproductive policies that make everything worse. But if we understand that our struggles are caused by an economic system that prioritizes profit over people, that concentrates wealth and power in fewer and fewer hands, and that requires a desperate divided workforce to maintain that concentration, then we can begin to build real solutions. We can organize across lines of race, religion, and national origin. We can demand an economy that works for everyone, not just the wealthy few. And we can create a society that actually lives up to its stated ideals, rather than using those ideals as cover for exploitation. The firestorm over the Somali community, like every other manufactured controversy about immigration, is designed to keep us from seeing the real fire that's burning down our collective future. Don't fall for it. Don't let politicians and pundits distract you from the real work of building an economy and a society that serves human needs rather than corporate greed. The choice is ours, but we can only make the right choice if we see through the smoke and understand what's really at stake. Thank you for your time and attention tonight. I hope I've given you some tools to think more critically about these issues. Remember, question everything, follow the money, and never let anyone convince you that your fellow worker is your enemy. Solidarity is our only path forward. Thank you.